First, I did want to ask you both, how heavily caffeinated are you? How exhausted are you right now?
Not caffeinated enough yet, but we'll get through it.
Yeah, my yesterday wasn't that crazy. I think it's today that is already shaping up to be quite busy.
Yep.
So what was going through both of your minds, that first thing that went through your mind when you heard the verdict, the guilty verdict that Donald Trump was guilty?
The truth is, I think it's so unprecedented. I think I would have been stunned either way. Like, I couldn't believe when it came back, guilty, guilty, guilty. But I also think had he been acquitted, I would have been stunned in a different way. I think the only thing that would have made a sort of intuitive sense to me was a hung jury.
Yeah.
Right? Because Trump is so divisive and so polarizing. I would have been like, yeah, of course, 12 people can't agree on anything.
Well, welcome to the campaign moment on this Friday, May 31st. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by senior national political correspondent Ashley Parker. Hey, Ashley.
Hey, thanks for having me, you guys.
So, Aaron, I wouldn't normally ask you, what's the big campaign story you've been following this week? But I'm pretty sure we all know what that story is.
Yeah, this is the smallest mystery in the history of this podcast. We're going to be talking today really only about the verdict in Donald Trump's Manhattan criminal trial, the politics of it, the significance of it, all those kinds of things.
There's so much to talk about, including how the politics of this trial have been playing out among Republicans. But first, I did want to ask Ashley, you covered all 4 years of the Trump presidency. So I'm curious, what's on your mind this morning after the verdict, and what have you been hearing about how the Trump team is feeling this morning?
I will add, not only did I cover all 4 years of the Trump White House and a lot of the aftermath, I also covered almost the entirety of Trump's 2016 campaign, which I think adds some context for my original sort of initial thoughts and questions, which is, will this matter at all in terms of politics, right? In terms of voters, in terms of the election? And I don't know, there are these breakthrough moments that do matter. And what was interesting was I was in Wisconsin last week. I talked to more than 60 voters just about the election in general. And unprompted, not a single one of them mentioned this trial. That said, I bet if I went back there tomorrow, it would be top of mind. It feels like one of the rare things with all of the Trump noise that actually broke through. But I guess my question is, how many of those voters will have changed their views or who they're thinking of voting for based on what happened yesterday? And that we don't know yet. I don't think the Trump campaign knows, and I don't think the Biden campaign knows.
Well, Aaron, I am curious what you'll be looking to gauge that question that Ashley has posed, is whether this will break through and actually impact the way people vote, whether that means they will stay home or vote for another person or be even more motivated to vote for him.
Yeah, I think there's a temptation with Donald Trump, given the long history that Ashley mentioned, to assume that, quote unquote, nothing matters. He's skated past so many controversies in his time. He won the 2016 election despite the Access Hollywood tape and all kinds of different things, floating the Muslim ban, things like that. I think it's worth putting that in context, though, that these things don't move the American people by 10 percentage points. 1 in 10 people are not going to change their vote because of this. They haven't moved on anything that's happened over the last several years. We're just that polarized as a country. And Donald Trump has kind of inoculated himself against many of these things by casting all of them as witch hunts and hoaxes and things like that. But that doesn't mean that these things can't lead to slight shifts. They may be shifts that aren't very measurable in polls because they're within the margin of error. But when something like this changes the minds of 2% of the American people, we had the last 2 elections decided by 1 percentage point in the key states. And so I think we need to kind of separate the idea that this is going to cause a massive shockwave through our electoral polls and our body politic from the idea that this could very significantly matter on the margins, and very small numbers of people changing their minds could matter.
Well, I am curious, too, about how Trump and the Trump campaign in the coming days and weeks are going to not only react, but integrate this verdict into the campaign. So, Ashley, I'm curious what you think about that. What indications do we have at this point of how they could even potentially use this verdict to their advantage?
Well, I think the indications are pretty clear, right? I mean, immediately he angrily left the courtroom, walked out.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace.
He gave the sort of screed he's given throughout the trial of, it's unfair, it's a witch hunt, it's biased against him. He put out that he was a political prisoner. They clearly had stuff ready to go. They almost instantly used it in fundraising appeals. And it's worth noting that WinRed, which is sort of the website for Republican donations, in the immediate aftermath crashed because there were so many people trying to donate. So I agree with Erin totally that, on the one hand, it will galvanize his base, which doesn't really matter in terms of votes because his base was going to vote for him regardless. And again, I agree that in an election that, like last election, will probably be decided by 40 or 60,000 votes across 3 or 4 critical states. That's where we're looking to see if it matters. It will help him in fundraising. And up until this point, he's had a fundraising disadvantage against Biden. So that could potentially be meaningful depending on how much it helps him with fundraising. But this will be a rallying cry, right? His mugshot is on T-shirts and campaign merch and proudly touted at rallies. So he is going to embrace it. The interesting thing is that both candidates in different ways have said, correctly, frankly, that the real verdict, if we're talking about politics, the real verdict comes on Election Day. And that's true.
Well, yeah, it is interesting because I think if we were just to think about how the trial actually went and the arguments made in the courtroom, many times it felt like the arguments or, just reading the reporting and paying attention to it, was it almost like a political argument that was being made? Because, we've talked on the show before and about how the Trump campaign this year, the fundamental theme is revenge or retribution or taking vengeance. And in some ways, it feels like a guilty verdict can play right into that theme.
Yeah, so one of the criticisms of Trump's defense is that it was too geared towards the politics of this rather than legal issues. Andrew McCarthy, who's a pundit that Trump often cites, wrote a column about this for National Review on Wednesday in which he basically made the argument that Trump's legal defense had kind of been supplanted by these political concerns, that Trump was having too much influence on the arguments that were being made that were geared toward the 2024 election. Things like relitigating whether there was actually a tryst between Trump and Stormy Daniels, having Bob Costello on the stand in testimony that went very poorly for the defense, at least it would seem from the outside. And then Todd Blanche, Trump's lawyer, went on Fox News on Thursday night and basically kind of suggestively pointed to the idea that Trump had been very involved in his defense.
How involved was Donald Trump in his own defense?
I mean, what do you think? I mean, very involved. And he's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing. He jokingly said to us a lot, sometimes he wanted to be the litigator. He wanted to be the one that was actually arguing because he's a smart guy and he knows what he's doing. We made every decision together.
He didn't criticize Trump, but the suggestion seemed to be there that there was some influence from the client that maybe guided things in a certain direction, which I think was really
guided
interesting.
The strategy?
Guided the strategy, yeah. And I think it's a very valid question to ask because, Donald Trump's efforts to cast these things as witch hunts and hoaxes has been very successful from a political standpoint of keeping his base behind him and keeping him viable as a politician. But that kind of conduct, that kind of strategy hasn't played well in a court of law. This is a man who's now seen major judgments against him in civil courts. He's obviously got the conviction now in the Manhattan case. It's just a very different venue. And so complaining about the process and, flouting your gag order, maybe that appeals to your base, but it doesn't necessarily help you when it comes to avoiding legal accountability.
And so he's now a convicted felon, and there are real life ramifications of that could impact his ability to campaign, no? Like, he is facing potential prison time. Do we know whether that's actually going to happen? And can you guys just talk me through the other ways that this verdict can actually hinder or, just influence the way he's able to campaign during these crucial months before the election?
It seems like, and again, who knows, right? I think the one sort of thing that's worth remembering is this is all just so unprecedented.
Right.
So I am hesitant to offer any guess. But, just in reading sort of lawyers and people smarter than me in this particular area, typically you might not expect actual jail time for a septuagenarian defendant of a sort of low-level, white-collar crime with no criminal record, no prior convictions at least. Typically, you wouldn't see that, but everything feels tricky, right? There's other cases where a defendant might have gotten in more trouble for so flagrantly and repeatedly violated a gag order. But in the back of everyone's minds, you can't remove this, this is a former president who is also running for president again. I'm curious what Aaron thinks about the jail time question.
Yeah, I think all of that is right. The idea, it kind of seems like a distant possibility that Trump would ever actually get prison time for this. The logistics of that would be very difficult because of the Secret Service and things like that. It is 34 counts, but it is 34 kind of white-collar counts. I think a couple things loom over this. One is, as Ashley mentioned, the gag order violations. This isn't just Trump being convicted. This is him doing a number of things during the trial that the judge suggested could have intimidated the jury or intimidated witnesses. He threatened to throw Trump in jail during the trial because of those things. Another thing is that while this is white-collar crimes, the argument that was put forward by the prosecutors and embraced by the jury was that this was done to influence the 2016 election. It's plausible, given how close the election was, that hiding this information from the American people could have changed the results of that election and changed the course of American history. How does Judge Rashan account for that when he does the sentencing? And then the last thing that I would point to is Donald Trump has made clear that he is not about to express contrition for his crime. He is going to deride this in the weeks until the sentencing, which doesn't take place until July 11th. And when defendants don't accept responsibility for their crimes and continue to question them, that can work against them ahead of sentencing. So yet again, we're seeing the politics of this and the way that Trump would like to spin this kind of running into the reality of our legal system and really a clash between those two interests right now.
And it's not just the reality of our legal system, it's also the reality of sort of the nation and the body politic. And even before yesterday's verdict, I mean, I can remember months ago talking to Democrats who, would love nothing more than for Trump to just disappear, right? Or for him to just get thrown in jail indefinitely. But sort of all the smart Democrats I talked to said the only way Trump fever and MAGA fever burns itself out, if it burns itself out, is if Trump loses fair and square in an election in November on election day. And there is this argument where when Republicans and certainly Trump himself are already priming the country to believe this is stolen, this is the deep state, this is everyone working against him, that something like jail time or even something like yesterday's verdict will make it harder to accept if Trump loses.
Well, there's so much more to talk about. And after the break, let's get into the reaction from the GOP to this trial and how they have been talking about it throughout. We'll be right back.
Hi, it's Michelle Singletary, the personal finance columnist here at The Post. If you're a regular reader of my column, you know that I love a good bargain. And I've got one for you today. Right now, you can get full access to the Washington Post for 99 cents every 4 weeks for an entire year. People often ask me why the Post has a paywall. As a very frugal person, I get it. We're being asked to spend money on a lot of things these days, and it can be overwhelming. But here's a good deal. You can get the Post for 99 cents every 4 weeks. I really want to encourage you to subscribe because we provide incredible investigative journalism, advice, podcasts, and so much more. If you follow my advice, you know I encourage you to live within your means. But I hope you can find some room in your budget for a Washington Post subscription because it's worth the investment. Go to WashingtonPost.com/subscribe. Support our vital journalism. Sign up right now.
So it has been pretty remarkable just watching how Republicans have been in lockstep and now circling around and behind Trump after the verdict, even from people you might be surprised by. Like I saw that moderate Maine Senator Susan Collins, she's someone that maybe has been willing to criticize Trump, have issued statements about the guilty verdict saying they were concerned about this.
Well, Susan Collins is always concerned.
Okay. Yeah, well, talk more about that. So that doesn't surprise you that that's just like a boilerplate statement from her?
Her response, it was notable to me, too, because you felt like if there was going to be a Republican who would not sort of retreat to partisan sides, it would be someone like Susan Collins. But I just think that the word most commonly associated with Susan Collins
is concerned,
is that she is concerned. Yeah.
Like a word cloud.
I think it's also worth noting that after Trump was indicted last year, in basically each of these cases, she gave very non-committal responses. I think the response to the Manhattan indictment from her was basically like, "Oh, well, I'll have to review this." She kind of spent days without saying much about it. The other one that really struck me was Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, who, of course, after Trump's post-January 6th impeachment, when he was voting to acquit on a technicality, said basically that the justice system can handle Trump.
We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one.
Mitch McConnell didn't say anything after the Manhattan indictment last year, but he felt compelled to say that these charges should have never been brought in the first place. He said that yesterday, despite not actually criticizing the charges in the first place. So I think those are a couple telling responses to how Republicans have kind of learned to, stop worrying so much and embrace the witch hunt narrative that Trump has put forward over the years, which hasn't always been a given. It's been a kind of a slow boil towards that.
And the other one that stood out to me was Larry Hogan, who's now a very moderate Republican in a very blue state of Maryland, who's running.
The former governor there.
Former governor running for Senate. He gave the sort of statement that I would have expected from both sides 10 years ago, right? Which is like, this is about respect for the rule of law. He didn't really weigh in one way or the other, pro or con. And that's what I would have expected 10 years ago. And then immediately Chris LaCivita, a top person in Trump's campaign, tweeted at him, like, you just ended your political career, which I actually don't think is true because, again, he's running in very blue Maryland. But it was so telling to me that was the other thing, was just that almost everyone's response was exactly what you would expect, right? It was just partisan. There was no one looking at this as like, what is good for how our justice system works, right? Or what does it mean to hold someone accountable? And what does it mean that no one is above the law? And the idea that, a top Trump person saying you deviated from party orthodoxy in the slightest bit, your career is over, I just think tells us where we are as a country right now.
That's exactly right. And one of the ways that Trump has brought his party to this moment is by punishing people like Larry Hogan who say things like that. So many Republicans have lost their careers by kind of stepping out of line and not towing his line on these things. And the message from the Trump campaign is basically, look, you guys, if you're going to say even this very boilerplate, non-committal thing about respecting the rule of law, we are going to come for you. And that's been a very good strategy for them as far as keeping the troops in line.
Yeah, we haven't really touched on this yet. We did talk about how unprecedented this moment is, but it is worth just taking a moment to appreciate the historic nature of what has just happened. I mean, what are the ways in which this is a test of the judicial system? And could it be viewed as the way politics has just been injected into the judicial system? What does that mean about that? And also the way we think about the presidency?
regardless of how you feel about this prosecution and the legal theory behind it, which even some kind of non-Trump critics were critical of early on, it's a major test for our body politic. How do you hold the most significant political figure of our time accountable, and how do people respond to that? A major political party is now basically kind of shoving aside the rule of law in unison and saying the courts can't be trusted to deal with wrongdoing by that most prominent politician of our era. To the extent that it's not something that has, the idea that this is a witch hunt and that this trial wasn't fair, I think it's worth noting that hasn't set in with a strong majority of Americans. The people who believe that is 4 in 10 or less. So it's not like even all Trump supporters buy into that. But to the extent that this kind of helps cement that among a larger portion of the country, if this kind of extends that to 45% or 50% of the country that kind of writes these things off as being all about politics and thinks that the judicial system cannot handle this kind of thing, or that all these prosecutions are politically oriented, the idea that our country, or at least a large portion of it, would have that little regard for the rule of law is something with very major implications downstream. It's not just about Trump, it's about the future of our country, because the foundation of it is that the judicial system can handle situations like this and that it's to be respected. And to the extent that that's no longer the case, it's a very significant thing. And that doesn't mean that bringing this case was wrong. There is a significant argument in favor of holding the most powerful people in the country accountable, and not doing that would be counter to the rule of law. But that doesn't change the fact that this is a huge test for how our country can handle something like this. And we've really only set about figuring out how well equipped we are to do that.
And the flip side is there's an argument that the judicial system worked as it should. And again, this is not me endorsing a guilty verdict or an acquittal, had that been the case, but that the system worked and that no one was above the law. A former president could be brought to court. Both sides, the prosecution and the defense, could have their say. And then a jury of his peers could render a verdict and deliver it. And it did work in that way. I think the thing I wonder about is it then sets up this existential challenge or question for the country, which is, and again, there's no law saying a convicted felon cannot run for president or even serve as the president, or I believe, although it feels logistically complicated, even serve from jail, right? So Americans could elect Trump and he could serve. There's no rule against that. But it is an interesting question of what does it say about a country that has a former president who is a convicted felon, who has promised retribution and vengeance and to be a dictator on day one. And, more than not necessarily the popular vote, but, an electoral college says, yes, this is the guy we want. What does that say? That's totally legal. It could happen. But what does that say about us and our values?
Well, I guess turning back to the politics of it, how has this verdict been discussed by the Biden campaign, by Democrats? And on that side, what do those reactions tell us about the political implications for Democrats and their voters? Will this fire them up? Will this turn them off to show up at the polls? What do we know about that?
It's a really good question. President Biden's big problem right now is that certain groups that have generally been much more strongly for Democrats, basically in every recent election, are just not as strong for him. That's Black voters, that's Hispanic voters, it's young voters. I could see something like this potentially crystallizing the choice for those groups that are less sold on Biden specifically, but maybe don't love Trump. As far as how Democrats handle this, the Biden campaign and the White House have been very hands-off.
Why is that, you think?
I think it makes a lot of sense during the trial because you don't want to look like you're applying pressure on the legal process. Republicans are all about applying pressure on the legal process right now. Democrats have tried to be more high-minded and above the fray on that because, they worried that would look like they were legitimizing Trump's claims that this was a partisan thing and that this was Democrats going after Trump in a court of law. But I think now that the trial's over, it creates a situation in which if the Biden campaign is not going to talk about this, Are they ceding the battlefield on this subject to Donald Trump? Are they letting him define this issue when they could be using this to political effect and making arguments about voting for a convicted felon? I think it's still a difficult thing for the Biden campaign to do because, again, that does risk playing into Trump's arguments about how this is partisan. But there is, on some level, the president has a bully pulpit and he needs to guide this messaging. He needs to provide a counterpoint to what President Trump is saying. And so it's not an easy situation at all.
Ashley, what about the response from Biden and Democrats has stood out to you, or what will you be looking to?
I mean, some of the same stuff that Aaron mentioned. It is a tricky thing for Biden. They definitely wanted a guilty verdict. Like, they believed Trump was guilty and they believe this was the quote unquote right verdict, right? I don't think you're going to see him crowing about this. I think it would look unseemly and not necessarily help him politically, right? Like his base, Biden's base is the base that erupted in cheers and, in bars and in Whole Foods throughout the country. He already has them. And, that small sliver of voters that we all care about because they will decide the election, he doesn't want to crow about it or seem overly happy. It's objectively not a good thing for the country when a former president becomes a convicted felon.
Before we leave, one last question that I have on my mind, and I'm wondering if this is on your minds or if there's another question on your mind, is how a lot of people, it feels like, have simply tuned out of this presidential election. They have these two choices that they're not particularly thrilled about. And does this verdict in some ways just simply inject energy for both sides into this race?
Yeah, I think it does. If you look at how much attention people were paying to this trial, it wasn't a whole lot. Part of that could be because it wasn't televised.
I mean, it's just so complicated.
It's so complicated. It's not televised.
I mean, I just want to add to the complicated. Another politics reporter on a chain was saying, she was with quote unquote last night when the verdict broke normal people, and they were very interested, but they had no idea what the case was about. They didn't understand it, and my point to her was, I'm not surprised because even political people don't really understand what the case is about, right? I mean, I am paid to understand it and cover it. And every time I am writing about it, I always find myself, asking an editor or going back and rereading articles to make sure I can phrase everything correctly, because it is just so hard to understand an obscure legal theory that is not something we're used to dealing with.
Right.
And also, I don't think we should underestimate the shorthand that now looms over this election. Whether people understand the ins and outs of business record falsification and the three underlying crimes and unlawful means, all these things we've been talking about for weeks, low information voters who have not been paying attention to this or have not been paying attention to the election more broadly now have a very present shorthand for something that defines Donald Trump at this point, and that's convicted felon. And that could matter to people. It may not be the most important thing to them. They might decide that inflation impacts them more personally, and that's a bigger factor in their vote. But the idea that this just doesn't matter, that they can label Donald Trump a convicted felon at this point in campaign ads, I think it's a very significant development because people don't have to reckon with the ins and outs of the legal theories and stuff. There is a verdict. To the extent that people respect that verdict, it could matter to them.
Again, I think the thing that I am just most obsessed with is obviously, what this means politically, but again, more what this means for the sort of nation America wants to be, and whether or not you agree with the case that was brought and agree with the verdict. I think it will say something, and I don't even quite know what, but about our country if on election day, and there's a very good chance this could happen, a very good chance it can't, but that Americans go to the polls and put a convicted felon back in office. It just feels so unprecedented and both unimaginable and utterly plausible.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. That is it for today's episode. Ashley Parker is a senior national political correspondent for The Post. Ashley, thanks so much for making time for us.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on this crazy news day.
And Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. And Aaron, we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Elahe. And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter. Also, make sure you subscribe to the Washington Post, of course.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute because, Aaron, your work and Ashley's and the rest from our incredible colleagues, you just can't get this breadth of coverage anywhere else.
That's right. And this is the last weekend that people can access all of it for a very rare deal. Do I have this right? 99 cents every 4 weeks for an entire year?
Yes, that is the deal, if you can believe it.
It's $52 for a whole year, less than $52.
Yeah, good job on doing the math, Aaron.
$51.48, is that right?
I'm going to have to trust you.
Okay.
But here's another figure, June 3rd, the number 3. You only have a few days left to get this deal. If you've been going back and forth on whether you should subscribe or get a subscription as a gift for someone, really now is the best time to do it. And the way you can do this is go to WashingtonPost.com/subscribe, okay? That's WashingtonPost.com/subscribe. There's also a link to this in our show notes, and we'll have a link for you to sign up for Aaron's newsletter there too. Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Renita Jablonski and Mary Jo Murphy. Our team includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Lucy Perkins, Monica Campbell, Laura Benshoff, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Svirnovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Allison Michaels, and Martine Powers. I'm Elahe Izadi, and have a great weekend.